Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'm John Lockwood. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education. It's my absolute privilege and pleasure to introduce Neil Selwyn to you this evening. Neil, as many of you would know, has come to us from the Institute of Education in London and has been a wonderful new colleague in the Faculty of Education. Not only does he bring his expertise, as you will hear tonight, to bear, but also his ability to be a wonderful colleague, a friend and peer for so many people. And I might say that one of the reasons that Neil is here is because another colleague, Nicola, who's sitting in front of me here, wrote to Neil at some stage and made a friendship with him over the internet around their research and around the ideas that she had. And Neil, as the sort of person he is, became very interested in what Nicola was saying and doing, and as a consequence, she invited him to come to Monash for a look. Well, anyone who comes to Monash for a look, they come and stay. And so, Neil, we are thrilled that Nicola was able to, in the first instance, dangle some interesting research ideas in front of you to cause that relationship to develop and to have you here at Monash in the Faculty of Education. And we look forward to listening to you tonight. Welcome. Thanks
very much. So it's all Nicola Johnson's fault, amongst other things. Hi, well, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time out to come to this. I'm going to try and speak, not using the microphone. If for any reason you can't hear at the back, do put your hands up and I'll start speaking to the microphone. But I kind of wanted to make it a bit more intimate. And thanks ever so much for John for the brilliant introduction and actually for getting me over here as well. It was Nicola and a whole bunch of other things that drew me to Monash. It's been a brilliant, actually it's nearly been a year. I keep telling people I've been here for a few months. It's actually 11 months I've been here, which makes me worried about what I've actually managed to achieve since arriving. But it's been a really good 11 months. It's been a really productive place to work. So I guess there's two kind of reasons for doing these talks. And Inaugural, I guess, the point of it is for me to actually kind of justify my existence and tell you who I am. So hopefully I can do that. But I think more importantly, the point of these Dean's Lecture Series is for the Faculty of Education to give a really good account of itself, to actually engage, look outwards, to engage with public issues, to kind of raise some controversies in education, start some big conversations. And I think that the topic of digital technology is one such issue. I think this is an area that we really need to be talking about within education, not just within the faculties of education and universities, but in the wider education community. And I think it's one education issue that we really need to make a site of public interest, public conversation, and hopefully public controversy as well. So I'm going to be very critical in the actual talk. Most of my work on technology tends to be quite critical, but I thought just before I began being critical, I'd try and allay your fears a little bit. I'm not a Luddite. I do understand technology. I really love it. I think technology is absolutely fantastic. So I'm not one of these people that just stands up and says technology is terrible and kids can't spell anymore and the world's going to hell in a handcart. My own personal interest in technology, I'm sure, is the same as most people here. If I'm to draw a map of my digital life, it is pretty much like this. I do have one of those big Macs on my desk. I have a MacBook Air. I have an iPod. I have a telephone. I have digital cameras, digital... I am living a digital life. So I do get the fact that technology is really, really... Well, it can transform the way that you can live your individual lives. I'm very interested in social media. I could probably tell you what most of those badges mean. I do use some of these things as well. I can see that Twitter is an incredibly important way of connecting with people around the world. And as John actually hinted at, you could argue social media got me here, because it was through things like Twitter, through social media, that I actually got engaged with the Learning and Media Research Group here, got involved with Nicola and Scott and everyone I work with now. So I definitely wouldn't be here without technology. And I'm also fascinated by emerging technologies. The whole idea of Google Glass, for example, I think has untold potential. Augmented reality, the idea that we can overlay information environments over physical environments, is fascinating. 3D printing, what's not to be excited? I saw the first 3D chocolate printer today. I was really excited about it. Imagine that. You can build anything out of chocolate. Technology is wonderful. But, although I've been at pains to tell you about how I'm not a complete Luddite, I think it's important not to get carried away with the kind of seductive qualities that digital technologies have. It's very easy to get very excited about the great things that we personally do in technologies in our lives and overlook, I think, the wider societal issues that are at stake here. I think digital technology is a site of massive societal change and therefore should be a focus of massive societal controversy. And certainly in education, digital technologies are a site of educational change and should be a site of educational controversy. So I think there's probably three things that I want to get across in this talk. That's one of the rules of marketing, isn't it? I have three main messages and just hammer them home relentlessly. So that's what I'm going to do. I think the first point of the talk is that digital technology in higher education is very, very messy. It's very, very problematic. It's very, very complicated. It always has been, and I think it always will be. And that's one thing we tend to overlook when we talk about digital technology in education. Converse to that, and this is a big concern of mine, I think the ways that we talk about digital technology in higher education tend to be too straightforward, almost overly simplistic. And allied to that, one of my big concerns is that most of the debates about digital technology in higher education have been co-opted, perhaps even hijacked, by different interest groups who are actually looking to make substantial and substantive changes to higher education. So it's a big site, I think, for quite fundamental reforms to the way that higher education and university education is actually arranged. And there's a danger, I think, that we're sleepwalking into some big fundamental reforms in higher education by not being involved in those debates. So I guess the third point that I wanted to get across is this is something that those of us that work within higher education, particularly those of us that are teachers, professional staff, administrators, students, managers, we need to be involved in these conversations and we need to be having an active say in the way that digital technologies are being used in our universities. So I guess the take-home message is that all of this great stuff about technology is not inevitable. There's not an inevitable technological future that we're slowly moving towards. These things are all up for grabs. These are all choices that can be made. And actually, those of us within education have choices. So I think we need to realise that and actually begin to actively making a choice. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about here. It's not all going to be negative, but as I say, I think we need to be critical rather than wholly kind of just welcoming technology as something that's going to happen to us. So I guess the best way of actually critiquing anything is to engage with or examine the dominant arguments and begin to test the assumptions which underlie most people's understandings of technology and higher education. So I guess this is the kind of talk that you would normally get when someone talks about digital technology and universities. So I'll just quickly run through the assumptions which lots of people hold. And again, these are things that you don't necessarily have to disagree with. You can kind of make arguments for them, but I don't think they're as clear-cut as often it's made out. So the first assumption is that we're living in an information age. We're living in an age where data and information are fundamental building blocks of society and economy. They're the main means of production. We're living in a world where the ability to create knowledge is the fundamental kind of building block to any form of economic success. We're living in a much more rapid age where information and data are kind of whizzing around on a global basis and very much fluid, and people like Castell's talk of the network society. This is fundamentally a different era than maybe 30, 40 years ago. So people talk about the knowledge society, for example, the digital age. We're living in this fundamental new epoch. And we've got young people coming into universities who are so-called digital natives, who are much more attuned with both digital technology and digital data and information, and somehow the world is different than it was. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but this is the fundamental building block of where universities seem to be situated. The second assumption, which is often not even really thought about when people talk about digital technology and education, is this idea of the institution somehow losing its significance. So lots of people talk of the death of the institution. And people often will look at the big proprietary interests of the 19th and 20th century. So, for example, government, the newspaper industry, even the music industry, for example, the book industry. All of these things are now seen to be fundamentally challenged by the information age, by digital technologies. I was reading a really interesting piece in The Australian a couple of weeks ago, and they were arguing from an Australian point of view, most of the big institutions that we hold dear to our hearts have let us down. So they're referring to the banks and Enron, for example, in a global perspective. But they're also talking about the Roman Catholic Church, for example. I mean, even Essington Football Club, I gather, has let a lot of people down. But I mean, it's this common trope that big institutions are kind of no longer fit for the 21st century, for example. So we have people like Clayton Christensen 20 years ago talking about disruptive innovation and the idea that institutions that don't continually innovate and change are dead in the water. So we've got an information age, we've got big monolith institutions which are no longer fit for purpose. And thirdly, it's assumed that we've got a crisis in higher education. Education's fundamentally broken. You hear this discourse all the time. Any way you look at it, in terms of the way it kind of takes students in, retains them or not, and then spits them out, doesn't seem to be fit for purpose anymore. In terms of the research that takes place, again, the research that takes place isn't really seen to be kind of fit for what the real world wants. In terms of the skills and competencies universities develop, again, they're not seen to be quite what big industry or post-industrial age wants. Even in terms of the university's role as a place for the public voice, and again, universities are not seen to be fit for purpose. So it's not surprising that the punchline to all of that is that we're now living in a period of fundamental change or challenge for universities. And this is where digital technologies, I think, hit this idea of fundamental reform of education. You hear this again and again and again if you look at any of the debates on higher education. Digital technology fundamentally is challenging universities to change in ways that you wouldn't have even expected even 10 years ago. So there's a whole bunch of reports. I mean, if you're interested in this kind of thing, the Ernst & Young report from about 12 months ago is a fascinating, if you're interested in kind of rhetoric and ideology, it's a great thing to read. The University of the Future, a 1,000-year-old industry on the cusp of profound change. I think with Ernst & Young, you need to take them really seriously because the rest of the world does. And what their analysis is of Australian higher education in particular is quite scary. And they don't really mince their words. So this is on the second page. Showing those of you at the back can't see this. The current university model, a broad-based teaching and research institution with a large base of assets and back office, will prove unviable in all but a few cases. So in other words, all of this campus and the other 70 million campuses that Monash have is going to be unviable in 5 or 10. I mean, that's really scary stuff. And if you read the report kind of talks about 5 drivers of change. The massive expansion of online resources, declining public investment, industry taking over training, and industry taking over the funding of research, the global mobility of students and staff, which is why I'm here and why Nathan's here and we have staff in the faculty from all around the world. According to Ernst & Young, when all of those factors meet digital technology, it fundamentally disrupts what the university is. I mean, there was one of the main quotes from the report is, digital technologies have transformed media, retail, entertainment, and many other industries, and higher education is next. Campuses might remain, but digital technologies will transform the way education is delivered and accessed, and the way that value is created by higher education providers, public and private life. It's really scary stuff. And the Ernst & Young report talks about how digital technologies will force universities to streamline. And they refer to how the product of the university is fundamentally changed by digital technology, how the channels to market are fundamentally changed by digital technology, and the delivery mechanisms of higher education. All of those phrases, I think, are really problematic, but this is the way that technologies seem to be reforming higher education along completely different lines. It's not just the Australian example. Michael Barber, who some of you may know in terms of his work in the UK over the last 20 years, has now popped up, working for Pearson amongst other people, but also at IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research. And their snappily titled An Avalanche is Coming report says pretty much the same things that Ernst & Young says. The global economy is changing, the cost of higher education is rising, funding is falling, basically the traditional university is screwed. And they talk about how digital technology is leading to unbundling, as they call it, an unbundling of all the different things that universities do, bits of teaching, bits of skills development, training, research, consultancy, etc., etc. University leaders need to take control of their own destiny, seize the opportunities given to them through technology. They need to provide broader, deeper and more exciting education. Leaders will need to have a keen eye towards creating value for their students through technology. So there is this rhetoric which I'm sure is familiar to lots of you that are dealing with universities, a perfect storm of the information age, the knowledge society, neoliberalism, digital technology, all coming together. We are all in trouble. So, that's the fun bit of the lecture out there. I think we need to be kind of circumspect about these arguments. It's very easy to get carried away with how technology is going to change the world. It's also very easy to get all doom and gloom about it. I'm not a dystopian. I'm certainly not a utopian. And I think the sanest response to all of these assumptions is yes and no. I mean, yes, there has been a shift towards information and digital technology and data being more important, but we certainly don't live in a completely different age to 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, there's been a slow shift, but there's not been a complete different kind of epoch that you would say is the information. You can argue we've always lived in an information age. It's just a different kind of type of information age. Similarly, institutions have not died. Essendon Football Club, I think, are playing again next year. But we still have banks, we still have a big music industry. It's just slightly changed the way it does things. We have a big book publishing industry still. It's just slightly changed the way it does things. So it's very easy to get carried away with this deinstitutionalisation. But again, the answer is yes and no. There's been some change, but not a complete transformation. Higher education is in crisis, but higher education has always been in crisis. And that, again, you can look 50 years ago, even 100 years ago, people were saying that universities were in crisis. And similarly, yes, digital technologies are changing universities, but not in kind of extreme ways that we're led to believe. So when I say I think we need to kind of think more critically about digital technology, I guess all I'm saying is we need to be less extreme in the views that we either kind of attach in a hyper-optimistic or a hyper-pessimistic way. The answer's always in the middle. There have been a lot of changes in education, in higher education, but a lot of them are quite superficial. There are a lot of deep-rooted patterns and deep-rooted structures which have remained essentially untouched. And there's lots of continuities as well as discontinuities in higher education in 2013. So I guess don't believe the hype would be the kind of approach I would take. It's very, very messy. Now, given that, I guess most people would kind of agree with that analysis if you think about it. Fundamentally, we're doing the same things but slightly different. It amazes me how digital technologies are generally talked about in really radical, transformatory ways. That there isn't this slightly more kind of circumspect view when we think about digital technologies in education. So this is the kind of the approach I wanted to take towards thinking more carefully about digital technologies. Why do we kind of think about technology in higher education in very extreme ways? It's worth kind of unpicking some of the ways that we're told digital technologies are coming into the university environment. One of the words that's fascinated me over the last few years is this idea of disruption. If you're interested in technology and education, you'll hear this word coming again and again and again. This is a disruptive technology. Universities are going to be disrupted. Teaching and learning is going to be disrupted. I saw today in the Guardian newspaper, there's an Australian company, Sydney. I can't believe this is not a spoof. They're talking about using drones to deliver textbooks to kids in Sydney because it's much more quicker than using the postal service. And the makers of these drones, who are Australians, you'd think they're sensible, they're not Californians. They said this is a disruptive technology. And like all disruptive technologies, there's going to be a few teething troubles, but we hope that by next year we can get over our 3-minute flight time that we can only do at the moment. So how on earth do you think, A, that's a sensible idea, but drones are not disruptive technology, they're disrupting nothing at all in education. But you hear this rhetoric again and again and again. And you hear it so much that you just begin to go along with it. You hear very few people kind of saying, hang on a minute, what is actually being disrupted here? What is actually changing? What is actually being transformed? You hear it, and you go along with it, you nod, and you think, yes, that makes sense, yes, I agree, we're all being disrupted. And you come across statements such as this from Jeff Jarvis, who's a big name in Digerati. He talks a lot about social media and social change. Education is one of the institutions most deserving of disruption and the greatest opportunities to come of it. And people just blithely agree with this and say, yes, that's really same stuff. If you look at that from a kind of discursive point of view, that's quite shocking. There's a kind of blame being put on education. Education deserves being disrupted. We deserve to be fundamentally kind of shook up. And then there's a kind of attribution that technology will somehow give us opportunities to come of it, and we should be grateful for these changes. I think that's quite, statements such as these are quite radical things to be saying, but you very rarely see them challenged, particularly in technology circles. People are just quite happy to go along with this kind of stuff. I think these are the conversations that we need to have an educational voice in, from those of us that are actually perhaps being disrupted, or perhaps being gratefully receiving these opportunities. Because if not, I think these things are just going to happen to us without us really having much of a say. So it's worth, I think, thinking about these disruptive technologies that have been foisted upon us. And you can look at them in two different sets. I think some of these promises of disruption are based around what you could call re-institutionalisation. So that's fundamentally shaking up the university institution. But the university fundamentally stays the same on the outside, but what takes place on the inside is completely different. So there's all of these things should be familiar to you. So the promise of blended learning, for example, is often seen as a kind of very disruptive. This isn't just the idea of using a little bit of online learning and a little bit of classroom learning. The people who purport to kind of push blended learning argue that it fundamentally remixes pedagogy, curriculum, assessment, the teacher-learner relationship, the idea of knowledge. This is seen to be a fundamental way of remixing and re-institutionalising universities. Most of you will have heard of the flipped classroom. Similarly, it's not just the idea of making your students watch videos before they come to the lecture. It's again, seen to be a complete shift to the way that we organise teaching and learning within universities. And there are radical kind of values attached to these things in terms of what we actually are doing within the classroom. But yet we blithely say, oh yes, we'll do some flipped learning, we'll do some blended learning. And these are not ideas that are ever challenged necessarily. Have any of you heard of MOOCs? Are any of you sick to death of hearing of MOOCs? MOOCs, I mean, that's another fundamentally disruptive technology. Again, a radical idea that you can actually make university education available on a massive, open, online basis. These are not just a kind of fancy way of marketing your courses to potential punters. These are this is a big changes are associated with this, but yet we're blithely going along and saying, oh, this MOOCs are a great idea, we'll set up a MOOC. For those of you that are interested in these things, the MOOC is very, very old-fashioned. It's very 2012. I was reading last month about the SPOC, the SPOC, the Small Private Online Course. So you can take that away and tell your Vice Chancellor about that. That's what Harvard are looking at. So they're for money, they're very elite, and you can see where it's all going. Virtual education, borderless education, the edges of university, all of these things are not just tinkering around the edges of what the university is. These are big changes to the way that institutions, and the institution of higher education is actually arranged. So the virtual university of Pakistan, the university of the people, which if you're interested in these things, is a fascinating kind of open source university that's available at very low cost, particularly for students in developing countries. These are radical changes to higher education. And these are things I think we need to be engaging with as the kind of the general education population, not just say, oh, that's interesting, it's just going along with the sidelines. Because if these things actually come to fruition, they have huge implications for the way that a university like Monash actually operates. Now, what's scary to me, kind of engaging with all these things and taking them seriously, is that there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on in the education technology world, which is even more radical than these re-institutionalisation technologies. And these are things you could talk about in terms of de-institutionalisation. So Ivan Illich talked a lot about de-institutionalisation and de-schooling in the 70s. Illich is now talked about a lot in ed-tech circles as being the kind of the guru to go to. His ideas are seen to be taken very, very seriously. These things, are, as I say, are even more radical. So if you think about not the XMOOC, which is the kind of for-profit institutionalisation one, but the original idea that MOOCs were talked about in 2008, 2009 by the Athabasca Canadian community, the CMOOC, that is completely against the idea of the university as an institution. That's all about allowing a lot of people access to higher education, quality education, without going anywhere near a university, without paying any money at all. It's a real sort of countercultural, communitarian, almost hippie ideal of what higher education could be. And if the CMOOC model ever took off, all of us would be out of jobs in terms of higher education, because that's not what the MOOC was actually originally about. You've got things like the Khan Academy, for example, which again you could see. I mean, have you heard of the Khan Academy? Sal Khan I don't know what he actually does for a proper job. He's a billionaire venture capitalist. He's a very, very kind of rich, successful businessman who decided that he could teach his niece her maths and chemistry homework much better than her school could by making little videos of him talking on a little chalkboard. And he made a few videos. As soon as you know, he's done 4,000 videos. And they're all online, and the idea is that the Khan Academy is a way that you can learn stuff. If you want to learn about European history, watch Khan's video. This is from Forbes, which again is an interesting. There are much more productive ways of learning everything than sitting in lectures. No field operates more inefficiently than education. A new breed of disruptors is finally going to fix it. Here's how to join them. And by the way, you can make $1 trillion. The US Department of Education estimated last month that the education market's worth between $5 and $6 trillion. So you can see why people are quite keen to disrupt. But anyway, let's not be too cynical yet. But the whole Khan Academy idea, again, just we don't need universities. This is all about deinstitutionalisation. There's a DIY university movement, which I think needs to be taken very seriously. This is harnessing kind of countercultural 60s values with digital technologies of today. Even the Melbourne Free University, which is widely touted in the Free University, makes great use of technology. If you want to learn about what they do, their new courses, poetry and sex, they've already got a march on traditional universities. They've got much better titled courses. Yeah, they do hold classes in pubs in Clifton Hills and Brunswick and all the usual places you would imagine they would do in Melbourne. But they also make good use of social media, videos, and all sorts. And this is, again, a complete anathema to the idea of coming to Melbourne University or Monash University and studying for 4 years for a degree. This is deinstitutionalisation. A lot of this is very kind of nihilist as well. The whole idea of the edupunk movement, for example. It's kind of stepped a bit out of fashion, but it's kind of this punk, pirate, they call themselves lots of different kind of mentalities. This kind of very anti-institution movement. I'm fascinated by people like Peter Thiel, I think that's how you pronounce his name, the guy that invented PayPal. Again, a Silicon Valley billionaire who decided that actually you can learn what you need to know without going anywhere near a university. And he actually offered fellowships for people to drop out of college and do their own thing without going to university. And this was one of his fellows, a guy called Dale Stevens, who set up a company called Uncollege. There's an unschooling movement trying to get kids out of school. This is a movement trying to get kids out of college. You can learn a lot better outside of the university. He's one of the only few successful field fellows, and he's made his money by going around the world giving lectures about how great it is not going to university. So I'm not sure that's a sustainable model. But this whole idea of hacking your education, if I want to learn something, if I really wanted to learn nuclear physics, I wouldn't go to a university to do nuclear physics. I would go online, I would bother nuclear physicists on Twitter, I'd read books, I might watch some videos, I might sneak in the back of the university physics lecture that I haven't paid for and get that as well. And this is the whole idea of this kind of hacking mentality. Now this is, you could argue, is quite fringe, but the trouble is when big billionaires like Peter Thiel take notice of it, you can see these ideas becoming more and more accepted within the mainstream. So if you look at France, for example, one of their big internet billionaires has just set up a school called 42. This is actually a university institution. So when geeks get involved with education, things go wrong. 42, Douglas Adams, the life of the universe and everything. It's worth having a look at. The argument here was that this guy was saying we haven't got enough adults that can actually program well enough. We haven't got enough coders. The school system and the university system in France is letting down millions of people who are just leaving without qualification. So what this is like, it's started last month, I think. It's a school for people without any qualifications, and they just come along and they learn to code amongst themselves. They're not necessarily taught stuff, they just come and they learn amongst themselves. So it's the principles of saying, we need to get out of this system. Now the reason I'm sort of banging home all of these examples is I think there's a way that technology is talked about in terms of higher education, I think is much more radical than we give it credit for. I think there are a whole bunch of values attached to these things that if we ignore, and we continue to ignore, by we I mean those of us working within higher education, I think it's a really dangerous thing. I don't think we can be just seduced by the shiny MacBook Air and the nice smart iPhone that we have and think that technology is somehow a benign, neutral thing. I think there are lots of values attached to all of these things that we need to get involved with. And in particular, We need to get involved with the technologies as they actually exist within the universities that we work in. Because the other thing that fascinates me is how, despite all this rhetoric and hype about how digital technology is transforming or disruptive or a revolution in higher education, the realities of the way that we use technology are far, far more mundane and prosaic and messy. And that's the other thing that I think is not very much talked about. The technologies that are used in higher education as we know it are actually not that exciting. Now again, there are lots of tech... Maybe I should be saying this. Have I gone too far already? I'm worried about what's going to come. Yeah, digital technologies are a huge part of what we do in universities, but they're not these exciting, shiny, super things. They're virtual learning environments, content management systems, business decision-making software. They are kind of the online leave accrual systems that we all have to engage with. Power plays, Turnitin, plagiarism. These are the technologies that are used within higher education. And as I say, you could look at a lot of the things that we use technology for and say, what has actually been disrupted? What has actually changed? What is new here? And often the answer is not very much. And it's worth thinking about that, I think, in all aspects of universities. The work that we do, the academic labour, the work that we do as professional staff and administrators, for example. How has technology actually changed what we're doing there? Teaching and learning, research, things like widening participation. There's all sorts of aspects of what a university is. You could argue the technology has perhaps not made the difference that it could have done. But if you think about the work that takes place within higher education, when I first came to Melbourne, I think it was October, I was shocked at how much books cost in Australia. They cost a lot more than they do in Europe. And I actually treated myself to buy a book. I bought myself one book at Christmas. And it was this book by Richard Hill, Academia, which was on this list of the ages 10 books you should read if you're interested in books. So I thought, fair enough. My God, what a depressing... Had I read this before coming, I would have ignored Nicola and John's kind of invitations and said, no way. If you read this book, Australian higher education is really in trouble. And what fascinates me about it's a list of moans about people working within higher education. What fascinated me was the way that digital technology featured in a lot of these gripes that people working within higher education were griping about the work that they did. So, for example, they were talking about Googleized, formulaic, dumbed-down education, the mechanical modes of pedagogy. And these are all quotes from working lecturers and administrators within Australian universities. You put up your slides, put your lecture notes online, make sure your arse is covered. And that was the way that kind of teaching and learning took place using technology. You have to deploy in-class technological pyrotechnics to get good student evaluations. I mean, these are all things I guess might be familiar to those of us that work in uni. Even in terms of the work as a professional staff and administrators. One of the big gripes was the bleed of your professional life into your domestic life. So one of the interesting things that Hill was talking about here was the ghost work that takes place as an academic or an administrator. The routine, unacknowledged bits of the daily grind, such as answering emails, completing electronic workload formulas, and grappling with online administrative systems. This is technology, in the realities of technology within the university. This is not disrupting anything. It's making aspects of work, overwork, for example, even more entrenched in the culture of what it means to work in the university. This is not the smart office of the information age. This is just the grind that has always taken place in the university. Now there's a caveat, there's the three caveats. First of all, Hill never worked at Monash, didn't interview anyone at Monash, nothing to do with Monash at all. Second thing, I didn't realise this, he's actually British. So maybe that's why there's a slight kind of whinging element to it. I say that, I don't really mean that. Yeah, so, and also the default setting for any academic is to be disgruntled, so I guess you could ask any academic anything and I'll mention it. But it was interesting how technology wasn't changing the disgruntlement of working in the university. So I think in terms of the work that takes place, digital technology has not necessarily changed much. Similarly in terms of teaching and learning. In fact, this is from a PhD, apologies, I thought the screen would be bigger. This is from a PhD student of mine who's near having his exam next month. Really passionate guy about education technology, wanted to find out what lecturers were using to use in their teaching and learning. I think he had 450 lecturers that he knew were technology enthusiasts, and he asked them, what do you do with technology in your teaching and learning? The two things you can see are PowerPoint and the VLE. Everything else, minuscule numbers of people. E-portfolios, blogs, e-assessment, when we teach with technology, it's generally PowerPoint and MOOC, and that's it. And that's, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's the realities of teaching and learning in higher education. A fascinating study I read a couple of months ago by David Johnson in the States, looking at the realities of professors' views of using technology. Really interesting study. He found out that most teaching staff didn't believe that technology necessarily enhanced teaching or learning. What was interesting was that he found out that it was the effects of having to use technology were mainly felt by more junior members of teaching staff. The tenured professors that could get out of it would just avoid using the technology altogether. And it was left to the kind of junior teachers to actually grapple with the minutiae of PowerPoint and virtual learning environments and experience the kind of de-skilling and the fragmentation of their work that accrued as a result. Which is a really interesting thing. It's kind of like class differences in terms of the work with technology. And a lot of it actually reminded me of this quite famous book from 20 years ago by David Noble, Digital Diploma MOOCs, which is well worth reading now. He did it in the late 1990s. Everything he says in it is kind of come true 15 years later, when he talks about the fragmentation of teaching and learning, the shifting from being a craft to a kind of technical process. And the outsourcing of the way that the instruction is actually delivered through the technology. So, you know, in terms of the work that we do, in terms of the teaching that we do, in terms of the learning that takes place, even in terms of the students that we interact with, you can argue that technology is not necessarily changing things. I'll skip through this quite quickly, but I was, again, shocked when I came here. This was in the first issue of the Union magazine that gets sent around to everyone. There was this massive diatribe about students and how terrible they were, and particularly in terms of their uses of technology. So students are distracted by texting friends, they're always on laptops and smartphones, they're gaming, which some of them actually think is a legitimate activity in lectures. They don't engage with the prescribed textbooks, they always make do with searching stuff on the internet. This is kind of, you know, I was wondering who this guy was. They're ill-equipped to understand research literature. They're mystified at why they should actually engage with new knowledge. The chance that they would actually kind of value independent research was remote, and the promises of either really, really bleak stuff. This is from the Vice Chancellor of Adelaide University in his inaugural speech. The fact that he felt confident, I mean, I don't disagree with him necessarily, but the fact he felt confident enough to say that, something which you'd think he would be on message, is quite shocking. So I think most people that work within universities acknowledge this. What fascinates me is, although we know all this stuff, why do we then also buy into the myth that technology is somehow going to make things different in a few months, a few years' time? Why is there a disconnect between what we know and what we want to believe? And I think this, I mean, you know, this messiness is all around us. In terms of the actual lecture theatres that we lecture in, technology is just bolted onto the ceiling, it's kind of on the side there, and you know, you've got a lot of people looking at a blank screen. That's not digital education at its best, is it? I actually picked this picture because I thought this was a great example of just how rubbish classrooms were. This morning, an ex-colleague of mine from London School of Economics just tweeted a picture that said, "This is a classroom." London School of Economics charges quite a lot of money to go there. Like, yeah, this is a classroom in any university, but this is the realities of the material realities of higher education in the digital age. It's not these shiny things that we're kind of told to believe. And even just in terms of disappointing messages as well, I'm quite interested in this idea of widening participation and social justice and the rest of it. So even when you look at the realities of something as exciting as a MOOC, the evidence is beginning to suggest they do nothing to widen participation or make learning available, well, credential learning available to those who didn't have it before. This is just the Duke University MOOC, one of the first MOOCs in bioelectricity from last year. 12,500 people registering. 7,500 of them watched at least one video, which was a start. 3,500 took a quiz, and eventually you get 261 finishing the course and getting a certificate. Now that's fine, and MOOC, people say that's not a problem at all, you know, people can dip in and out, but this idea of somehow the technology disrupting patterns of participation, I think, is questionable. So we've got work, teaching, learning, students, social justice, the materialities, all of this stuff I think we need to take has read that it's not as straightforward as things being somehow made magically better. Things are very, very messy. And it's the same story that there's often been with technology in education. This is from Larry Cuban. Computer meets classroom, classroom wins. And he's talking about the way that education shapes technologies. You could have computer meets vice chancellor, vice chancellor, and computer meets anything in terms of the institution of the university. The university shapes the technology probably more than the technology shapes the university. The grammar of higher education kind of persists in the way that we use these things. So I think this to me is a real conundrum for those of us in higher education. We've got in a really odd situation where we've got these kind of mounting predictions of revolution and transformation and disruption, and everything's teetering on a knife edge and going to change. And just this continued decades of stagnation, of things gradually changing, and we're muddling along, and we're working around, and we're getting by. So am I just wrong in thinking that nothing's ever going to change? It's always, or are we just on the cusp of something, and we just need to wait a few more months or a few more years? I'm not sure. But I'm increasingly becoming more despondent with the promises of technology. I think we need to actually be a bit more realistic. I mean, there's often this trite thing in technology where people say, we were promised jetpacks, but we got X. You could say in higher education, we were promised jetpacks and we got PowerPoint. Or we were promised jetpacks and we got Moodle. The point being, we could do a lot better, I think, with the technology. And I think even the most one-eyed proponents of education technology, even the real hype mongers, realise this. So when I was in London, a very famous person I worked with called Diana Laurelart, who's a kind of guru of e-learning, gave her an Inaugural talk, and it was one of the most balanced things I've ever seen in my life. I was expecting her to say, rah, 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 technology. One of the great things she said was, education is on the brink of being transformed through learning technologies. And she paused and said, however, it's been on that brink for a few decades now, which I think is perfect. I think we need to think more carefully about why we're in this kind of this status, this uneasy status quo, kind of phony war. Think what we can do about it. I think we can do a lot better. And that, I guess, is the crux of what I'm arguing here. I think that the future of digital technology in higher education is not certain. I think it's something that's negotiable and something that we can contest. It's something that's up for discussion, not something that we just blithely wait to happen. And I think, above all, we need to acknowledge that digital technology in higher education is about values. There are values attached to all of the stuff that I've just presented to you in terms of disruptive technologies. And there are values attached to the way that we encounter and work around or make use of digital technologies. And we need to see technology as something which is imbued with values. It's not just this neutral, benign thing that happens to us. It's something that we actively have to engage with and think about in terms of ethics and morals and values and all those difficult things. So in some ways, the key questions I think we need to ask about digital technology, not the usual ones of does it work, is it efficient, but more fundamental things about what is education for? What should education be like? And I think then it becomes much more messy. And this is I guess one of the main points of the work I'm trying to do here in Monash is actually try to problematise the use of technology in education and open it up to other debates, other conversations, other values. Because the thing that worries me is that the values which are implicit in the technologies at the moment, I think, present a very narrow view of what education is and what education is for. And I think in some ways we need to think a bit more carefully about them. So just as a way of kind of rounding off my thoughts on these things, and again, these are things which I'm only just beginning to think about and write about, so they're very half-cocked. Is that an Australian phrase? Half-cocked? Half-baked? Not really thought through very well off the top of my head. These is the conversation which I think I wanted to open up, and I think we should be opening up in education about these things. These are the values, I think, are some of the main values which underlie a lot of the ways that digital technologies are being brought into higher education. Interestingly, I think often from outside the education establishment, or at least outside teachers and students and managers. I mean, you could argue that there's a kind of technocratic cadre of people working within universities. I mean, what kind of Ron Barnett describes as the entrepreneurial university. So these are not necessarily people who are not located within the university, but in terms of teachers' values and learners' values and the values of professional staff, administrators and managers, I think these are the things which are attached to the technologies we use. There is a kind of techno-fundamentalism, a belief that technology will somehow change things. I think that's implicit in some education technologists. This fear of missing out. Have you heard of FOMO? YOLO is you only live once, which is just a philosophy which I view, as you can see. But FOMO, fear of missing out. The next new technology is coming along, the MOOC, what do we do? Oh, we'll have to have a MOOC. The next new technology is coming along, the flipped classroom, what do we do? We'll have a flipped classroom. I think that mentality does persist. The Everest syndrome. Why do you need it? Because it's there. Why did you climb Everest? Because it's there. There's also a kind of technocratic approach that technology does somehow make the institution or the system more efficient and more effective. I think that's a value which is implicit in a lot. I'm not arguing against these values, I'm just saying we need to acknowledge them and think alternatively as well. There is, I think, a fundamental faith in increased individualism, individualisation, the idea that the individual can somehow be more in control of what they do. So in terms of learning, for example, a lot of the values attached to the technology is that it's learner-centred, learner-determined. The learner is in control of the learning that takes place. You could argue that it's a bit more than just individualism, it's a kind of libertarianism, that it's a fundamental freedom or liberty of the individual to actually choose what they do, and technology allows them to do that. And I think there is a faith in market forces and choice, a kind of neoliberal mentality behind a lot of these technologies. And the idea that education and research and things that we do in universities can be commodified, they can be put into discrete little bundles and given values and exchanged and treated as commodities. Which again, I'm not arguing against this, I'm just saying these are things we need to think about. There is an argument that yes, not just the public sector, but private actors, private interests can perhaps more efficiently do some of these things. And there's also, I don't know whether it's a Silicon Valley sensibility, but there is this kind of startup Californian mentality that with a lot of programming knowledge, a bit of gung-ho, throwing a lot of money at stuff, being entrepreneurial, being a bit risky, being a bit innovative, we can somehow fix education. Sebastian Thrun, the guy that set up one of the big MOOC companies, recently just said, education is broken, it's going to take Silicon Valley magic to fix it. But there is that kind of mentality that these outsiders can perhaps do this stuff better. If you can set up something like Facebook, you can probably make a university run more efficiently. Now, I haven't got a problem with any of that necessarily. There are lots of great advantages to these values. Lots of people can gain from this. From a supply side point of view, you could argue that perhaps universities could be made more efficient. But I think we need to think about the limitations to this way of thinking as well, and to these values. I think one of the great underlying ideas behind a lot of these things is this idea of education somehow being a computational project. So something which is applicable to programming and coding and algorithms, and you can kind of fix it. It's like an equation that you just need to tweak and somehow it can be made better. Again, that's a fine way of thinking about things, but what's left out is quite a reductionist way of thinking about education. What isn't in that algorithm or that code? The idea of individualism as well. You can argue for it as long as you like. And lots of very good arguments why things should be more individualised. But with individualised responsibility comes individual risk. You are more responsible for having a good education. You are more responsible for learning, which is great. Some people do very well at that, but what happens to the people that don't do so well? Is it all their fault? The whole idea of customers, for example, making learning something which is a product which is sold. There's a relationship then between the vendor and the customer, which perhaps is different to the relationship which came before between the university and the student. And also this idea of experimentalisation, the idea that we can learn through failing. We just need to experiment a lot. Let 1,000 flowers bloom and somehow successful happen. Again, that's probably a great way of being innovative, but does that apply necessarily to education? Does it matter if a learner fails? Maybe that's a value that doesn't sit very well with education. And the other thing which I think is fascinating, particularly about this kind of Silicon Valley commercial mindset, is I think a profound distrust of experts and a profound distrust of educationalists as well. The Sebastian Thrun quote, education needs to be fixed with Silicon Valley magic. There's a distrust of people within education. Fundamentally, we've got it wrong for the past century or so. Why should we be trusted any further? Surely we can bring some outside expertise in the UK at the moment, our Minister of Education refers to the education establishment as the blob. It's kind of updating from Marx. Yeah, you're looking incredulous. He actually says this in speech. He'll refer to the blob The education establishment, the academics, the experts, the teachers, the kind of agents of not changing anything. And there's that kind of mentality in education technology as well. You can't really trust teachers or education experts to do anything. You need to kind of bring in expertise from elsewhere. Now, I don't say any of that's wrong. I'm just saying that we need to think about these things. We can't see these technologies as neutral. They are laden with values. What fascinates me is what values are perhaps missing from the technologies that we use. What values would we like to see in the way that these digital disruptions and digital changes are taking place? Now, I'm not sure whether you'd agree with all of these values. I'll skip through evil media. If you want to know about evil media, you can ask me afterwards. But I think these are values which I don't see occurring so much in the technology discourses and the technologies that we use. So this idea of a public education, a public university, again, this is a kind of hot topic in the UK. The idea of what public education actually is. So it's there for everybody, it's not an extended arm of commerce. There's values in terms of social cohesion and equality and democracy. Those are not things which are necessarily talked about within digital education. These ideas of social justice, for example, academic freedom, just education being a kind of communal thing. You don't necessarily see those values in the technologies that we're using. I'm fascinated by this area of just human contact. The idea that maybe education and teaching and learning and research and the work that we do is a human thing. You talk to people, you have conversations. That's why we're all here now. This is why people hang on to lectures and seminars, because there's something about being in the presence of a teacher or a colleague or a co-learner. There's something about the utterance of learning. There's something there that's fundamentally human, which I'm not entirely sure is necessarily in lots of the technologies that we use in our everyday life in universities. And also this idea that universities are a space for just dissensus and conflict and this idea of questioning things, just being critical for its own sake, rather than necessarily having an end product. I'm not sure these values are necessarily implicit in the technologies that we're using at the moment. Now you can disagree with all of these things, and you can maybe have your own set of values, and you can have your own ideas of what's missing from the technology in education, but I think these are conversations that we need to have. And the key question is, what would the technologies that we use in universities look like if they were maybe imbued with other values than the ones which I presented before? What if they weren't so individualised or commodified or commercialised or etc., etc.? And that's just a really tricky set of questions. I'm not sure there's any answers at all. Very, very briefly, just to think about three. These are just things I'm struggling with. Virtual learning. When I'm teaching people online, when I'm trying to get people to learn online, what is actually going on? And it worries me when I use virtual learning environments that there are values associated with them that are not necessarily the values which I would necessarily endorse. I do feel like I'm sometimes just dumping content, or I'm trying to force very artificial discussions amongst students, and I then get really confused why students don't discuss, and they just put their quote and then they run away for a week. That worries me. How can I change that? It's, certainly when I'm teaching face-to-face. I mean, I'm using PowerPoint now, but there is something about using PowerPoint which dumbs down teaching to just a set of 6 bullet points each slide. And you need to refresh every minute, otherwise people get bored. And you must put the PowerPoint on the virtual. That worries me as well. What values am I kind of, in terms of transmission of education, and education being about broadcasting rather than interacting? Chalk and talk. How different is this setup to the lecture theatre of the early 20th century, or even the 19th century? And even the working conditions as well. In terms of the way that I've got colleagues with email boxes that are above 1,000 unread emails, which is just unbelievable. The pressure, the idea of passing on responsibility by CCing in everybody, and then passive-aggressively BCCing in John, so you kind of, everybody knows. But you can see...
That was you!
But this whole idea of the work that takes place, the working conditions, the technologies, in terms of accountability and surveillance and monitoring. This is just a great book by an academic in Brisbane. She looks at different sectors of the creative industries, filmmakers and university academics. She counts them as creatives as well. And she quite rightly points out the way that digital technology brings work home, destroys the relationships we have with our families. And she says, why do we not think that checking an email on Sunday night is working. Nearly all of our interviewees check their emails on a Sunday night because they just saw that's something they had to do and get clear before they could go to work. Work just kind of seeps into our waking hours. That worries me as well. I think we need to think otherwise about these technologies. How could we rearrange these things? How could we imbue them with values of intimacy and emotions and morals, and all the kind of things I've just espoused? And that's the really tricky question that I'm not sure I've got any answers to at all. It's really difficult to challenge these things. And as soon as you start suggesting alternatives, they just sound stupid on their own. But I think this is the kind of conversations we need to be having. How can we think otherwise about the ways that we use technology in education? So I'll just come up with a couple of, these aren't my own ideas, so they do sound stupid, but they've nothing to do with me really. How can we think about online learning in a different way, for example? I'm fascinated by things like the Digital Bill of Rights. And this was a group of similarly concerned educators earlier on in the year that came up with a kind of agenda for online learning being set up slightly differently. And these are things that you very rarely hear talked about on e-learning courses, for example. It's the idea that students have a right to know about the data that's being collected about them, have a right to be kind of made aware of issues of privacy, for example, and how the data will be used above and beyond the course. I have no idea how the data that I collect on Moodle is used above and beyond the course, but I'm sure it is reused. Students have a right to create their own intellectual property. We're always getting students to create things online. What happens to it afterwards? There's a big movement to give students their own domain name throughout their university career, so everything they create is their own. It doesn't belong to the university. Students have a right to know how their participation supports the financial health of the online system in which they're participating. That's quite a controversial one. But even these things, students have a right to care, diligence, commitment, honesty and innovation. They're not being sold a product, nor are they the product being sold. They're not just consumers. It's about trust. And again, things like trust, you very rarely hear these values talked about in terms of digital technology. Students have the right to get great teaching online. There should be demand that the people arranging, mentoring and facilitating their learning online should be financially, intellectually, pedagogically valued. Not just hived off to the cheapest kind of teaching support that you can find. It sounds stupid when you put it like this, but I think these are just things, they're provocations. This isn't a recipe for kind of great teaching and learning. And this as well, online learning should be about innovation and imagination and curiosity and experimentation. And it should be more open than it actually is at the moment. Dispositions of questing, tinkering and connecting. We must remember that the best learning imparts the gift of curiosity and accomplishment and the passion to know and learn even more. Those are words that I very rarely think of, and this is probably me being a rubbish teacher, but the idea of passion and curiosity, and it's very difficult to kind of get that going with a lot of the online systems that we use. Is this all pie in the sky? I'm not entirely sure, but these are interesting conversations which you don't normally hear in terms of teaching and learning. Even the way that we teach face-to-face, I guess you could think about differently. Could we teach without PowerPoint? I know people had Prezi. Do you remember Prezi, that thing from a couple of years ago that made everybody feel seasick because it was not used anymore? But it was interesting because people were trying to get away from this kind of hegemony of PowerPoint. The idea that everything is in bullet points. PowerPoint is designed for business room pitches. It's not designed for teaching and learning. By sticking everything into bullet points, you get students wanting bullet points and then complaining when they don't get bullet points. I've tried to teach not using PowerPoint and students have complained. They want the PowerPoint slides. How do you get over that? How do you think differently? I've got some colleagues that will only use images on PowerPoint and won't use any words at all. And they'll just use it as a way of illustrating what they're saying. Or illustrating stuff that can't be communicated verbally. That might be one way forward. But there must be other ways as well. How do we get around just not dumping content on virtual learning environments? Perhaps we should only use virtual learning environments for creating content, getting students to create their own content. There was a great idea in a seminar we had last week in the Learning New Media Research Group, where the guy was talking about, instead of giving a reading list, getting the students to create their own resources. Not even reading lists, he said just get them to start producing images or submitting their own images of issues that they think are important in terms of the topic that you're teaching. And then that leads to a whole new set of learning opportunities. I guess it's about using technologies that fit our own pedagogic values. if we see ourselves as socio-constructivists or disciples of Freire, or however we see ourselves as educators, we should be using the technologies in those ways, or inventing our own technologies, rather than just complaining that Moodle doesn't quite do what we want it to do. I think these are all interesting things that we need to think about. And also in terms of work as well, how could we use digital technologies differently in the work that we do as teachers, learners, administrators, managers? Would it be possible to switch email off for the weekend, not allow anyone access to My Monash at the weekends? Then you wouldn't have this bleed of work. Ferrari, the car company, have stopped CC and BCC. Actually, you're only allowed to CC a message to 2 people. Any more than that, you have to do it again and again and again. It makes you think about, do I really need to include 33 people in my email and then John BCC? People have tried to change email etiquette in the workplace, and it never ever works because it's a very difficult habit to break. But there must be ways of thinking differently about the way that we work with digital technologies as well. These are all frivolous points, I guess, but they kind of make a serious suggestion that technology in education is contestable. We should be able to challenge these things and think differently. It doesn't come down from God and we have to do these things. We should have choices. And I think the only way we can have choices is by getting involved and thinking about how can we create and promote the values that we think are important in the ways that we do things. But it's just a really difficult thing to do. And I've been trying to do this now for nearly 20 years. And generally, it's nice that you've all turned up today, but generally indifference or no one listening at all. And it's just very, very difficult to be critical of digital technologies because we're still in this mindset that technology is fundamentally a good thing, and to oppose it is to somehow be opposing change. There's a book, I've just finished a book which is coming out next, this is a very subtle way of plugging in, next month, Distrusting Educational Technology. So I was at a seminar in Hong Kong in May, and my publishers were there, and they put a very nice leaflet of all the books that the presenters were presenting, had written. My one was there, and it was called Distributing Educational Technology. Even my own publishers couldn't imagine that anyone would be stupid enough to write a book called Distrusting. What do you do? All publicity is good publicity, but that was terrible publicity. My point is that I think we need to actually kind of not just go along with, we need to actually kind of stand up and say there are things that can be contested here, not just go along with the flow. And this Evil Media book, which I'm halfway through, which I think is fascinating, makes the point that I think technology, it's all about politics, it's all about conflict. It's an ethical challenge. You can either become a transparent intermediary in the networks and change the communicative power, or become oneself an active, transformative movement. In other words, we can stand up to these things, or we can go along with the flow. I'm a bit mealy-mouthed. I hate challenge, I hate conflict, but I'm increasingly beginning to think these are things that we need to stand up to. But how you do it, I'm not sure. I think you do need to practice what you preach. So I think the way that perhaps I teach in the future, the way that I work in the future, the way that I research in the future should be thinking about the values of technology. The other thing I think is just needing to talk about these things and get people interested, and perhaps get them angry, perhaps getting them kind of riled up. It amazes me that digital technologies like virtual learning environments are not the main focus of student politics, student protests, for example. I've come from an education system where the students protest all the time about things like fees and reduction of staffing and blah, blah. No one ever complains about virtual learning environments. I've been looking at the Monash student elections, and the only time you ever see technology mentioned is some of the candidates saying, I will make sure that all our lectures are recorded and put on Moodle. That's the weakest argument from a student politician I've ever heard in my life. They should be saying, I'll make sure that we have a fantastic virtual learning environment which works perfectly. No, not at all. I think a lot of the things that people get angry about in education are the issues I've just talked about. This idea of we're not customers, for example. That's digital technology is at the heart of those debates, but somehow people see them as separate. That just, I don't know, saddens me. But I think we need to continue publicising these things. So I want to start thinking about technology in education in terms of questions rather than answers, problems rather than solutions. And these are the things I think we need to ask about digital technology and higher education. What is actually new here? What are we gaining, but also what are we potentially losing? What are the unintended consequences of when technologies are used in higher education? What are the second order effects, the stuff that happens once the technology has been used? What's the real problem that we're trying to address through the technology? What is the flipped classroom actually an answer to? And I think thinking about the problem rather than technology is really, really important. What underlying values are implicit in the technology we use? And in whose interest are the technologies work? I'm not saying there are any black and white answers to this, I'm just saying these are things we need to think about. And in some ways, I think we just need to grow up a bit when it comes to technology. It worries me that some people are still stuck in this kind of childlike wow factor. All technologies are fantastic, and you're kind of, oh, this is brilliant. And there are some people who are kind of stuck in an adolescent response to, oh, they're all terrible, and the man is against us, and the kind of Julian Assange reaction to technology, that it's somehow this big capitalist conspiracy and it's all terrible. We need to move on from that as well. Notice when you talk about Julian Assange in Australia, people get very, or maybe it's a Melbourne thing. In Britain, people are quite suspicious. Anyway, but we need to move on from being either kind of gleefully welcoming or completely rejection. But I think we just need to be more adult about the messiness and the real, being more realistic rather than idealistic about technology and education. So anyway, I hope that that's provided some food for thought about digital technology in higher education. I also hope it's given you some kind of sense of who I am. As I said at the beginning, justifying myself. I am just a typical academic. I've got no answers at all, I've just got a bunch of questions. I could have just stood up and said it's all very complicated, it's far more complex than you imagine, and that's it. I haven't got any big solutions or a big manifesto. I just think in some ways these are things that we need to be just starting conversations about. So I hope, for all the time that I stay here, which will hopefully be until I retire, when I'm 65, that these are conversations that we can get going in Melbourne, in Monash, in Australia, and make this the start of kind of critical perspectives on digital technology and education, because I think there's a real need for it. So anyway, I think there's wine in the next room, isn't there?
Yeah, let's have a couple of questions first.
Oh, first.